Welcome to this video where we're going to talk about the feelings of exasperation, disillusionment, being jaded, stressed, fed up, etc. that many people have with the world. These feelings, they're not irrational. Like, the world is actually a very crazy place. You look around you, like what's happening on the news, or you scroll through social media, and ultimately there is a lot to be exasperated about because there's just so much bullshit everywhere. There's so much chaos. There's tension. Ultimately, it's understandable why people feel this way. But I want to show you that this exasperation or disillusionment is actually a good thing because it means that you're becoming aware of some of the most fundamental truths about life and that you can start to put yourself back on a real path. Ultimately, this video is about the idea that the world is not reality. And the exasperation and disillusionment that we feel is because we bought into all of the myths and all of the conditioning and the propaganda and all the bullshit that tries to make us believe that something unreal is real. And when you start to become exasperated and disillusioned, it's because your real self is screaming to come back to the surface of your life. So in this video, we're going to look at how we ended up in this disillusioned state in the first place, but then we're going to look at what we can do about it so that we can find freedom and wholeness and go back to our real lives. So the key thing to take away from this video is that the world is not reality. Reality is aligned with the truth. It's about flow. It keeps moving. It keeps evolving. It leads towards wholeness. In fact, it is wholeness. The world is all of our interpretations and the systems and structures and economic models and so on and so forth that we have created as a reaction to reality itself. Normally, when we come in from a reactive place, it's because of fear, it's because of scarcity, it's because of doubt, it's because we're driven by shame and we don't actually know who we are. And so all of these systems that we've created, all of these models that we use to make sense of the world are ultimately just based on human beliefs. That's fine. Obviously, humans need to believe things to function in the world. But the thing with beliefs is that if we're unreal, we have an unreal relationship with ourselves because we're driven by shame and we're disconnected from who we really are, then the beliefs that we have are an extension of that same disconnection. And so the systems that we create, the world that we project as a kind of matrix over life itself, becomes just as unreal as we are. And if you don't know that, then you just end up going out into the world and you see this kind of layer or matrix or veil that we've put between ourselves and life collectively, and you think that it is the truth about life. And when that happens, you start to create an identity for yourself that belongs to the world, not to reality. And that means that you're constantly going to be walking around in a state of friction. When you treat the world as reality in this way, you basically end up disowning your true nature, all of the real things about yourself. And this causes conflict. And there are three main kinds of conflict. So let's go over these quickly, and then we'll start to look at what we can do about resolving this situation. So if the world is unreal, because it's an extension of our unreal relationship with ourselves collectively, and the beliefs that extend from this, then ultimately we find ourselves in a situation where we're still real, because what's real is always real, but the way that we are encouraged and asked to interact with the world around us becomes unreal, increasingly so. And we'll get into that in a bit more detail in a minute. But there are three main reasons why the world being unreal causes us to start to feel disillusioned and exasperated and to basically lose hope. And the three reasons are, first of all, that the unreal world we've created goes against our core human values. Our core human values, ultimately, for the sake of brevity, are anything that lead us towards wholeness. Wholeness at the level of ourselves, wholeness at the level of other people and our relationships with them, and wholeness in the sense of having a connection to life itself, which means that we keep flowing and evolving and growing, etc. The world, when it's unreal, asks us to stop that growth process. It asks us basically to stay the same for the majority of our lives once we finish university and all that kind of thing, so that we can fit ourselves into the economic models and the economic systems that require us basically to not grow in alignment with our values. And so when we're feeling disillusioned and exasperated, 90% of the time, let's say, it's actually because we feel the need to rebel against this unreal relationship that we're having with life, because we're not affirming and living our own values. We're not expressing our creativity. We don't feel free. Maybe we're not getting in touch with nature enough. All of these things that are just essential for human happiness are not generally built into the structure of the world that we've created. And so a big part of the conflict that we feel that leads to exasperation is just that we're not in alignment with our own values. The second thing is that the world, because it's built around beliefs and linear ways of thinking and ideology, then it tries to squeeze us into ideological boxes. No human being can ever really be squeezed into an ideological box. Ideology is just a way of making sense of life. It's a way of feeling that we have control over all of the chaos and confusion and the messiness of real life. And so the more that the world tries to squeeze us into an agenda or into an ideology, and the more that we buy into that and agree to it and try to squeeze ourselves into those boxes, well, the more friction and frustration we feel, because ultimately we're just curtailing all of the depth and expansion and wisdom that is waiting to burst out of us, because we voluntarily put ourselves in a box for the sake of fitting into these ideologies and agendas. Sometimes those ideologies and agendas can open our mind a little bit, or they can set us free. But the more we attach to them, the more we think that we need that ideology as part of our identity for survival, the worse it gets. And so if the world is basically fueled by people trying to get us to buy into these unreal agendas and ideologies so that we keep giving ourselves to the system, basically, then ultimately we're going to feel disillusioned, because we're trying to make ourselves live in an unreal way when our realness never goes anywhere. The third thing is that the world does not share your moral code. Ultimately, we all have a kind of innate sense of what is true, what is real, what is whole. And ultimately, if you want to simplify the issue of morality, it's about aligning ourselves with that wholeness, with connection. The world, because it's fragmented and it's designed to keep everybody separated and to be in these little boxes and to live as economic units and all this kind of stuff, and where we're putting profit over people and all the things that people talk about and complain about because we know deep down that it's not real. All of that stuff is going against what we know is true at the level of morality. But when we fit ourselves into the immoral way of being that goes against our own moral compass, then we're constantly just bringing more friction and more disillusionment into our lives. And so those three things, going against our values, going against putting ourselves in ideological boxes, and going against our own moral code just to fit into the world, are actually what cause people to feel disillusioned and exasperated. And the way back home is to start rebelling against all that stuff, not adapting to the world, but making the world adapt to you. So let's get into that in a bit more detail. So we find ourselves in the situation where the world is unreal and it's asking us to go against our values, try to squeeze ourselves into these bullshit ideological boxes, and to go against what we know deep down is the moral truth. And when we go against our realness in that way, it creates an inner friction. We feel the sense of the void. We feel that inner itch that needs to be scratched, or the empty feeling that just haunts us or follows us around because we're disconnected from the truth about ourselves. In that state, we're just walking around with all this friction. That's the key word. It's just friction that people can't get rid of. And so normally when people feel that friction, they try and externalize it. They don't look inwards, they externalize it. And this explains, in my opinion, the political situation of the West right now, let's say. People are becoming more and more polarized to the left and to the right, and we can make a whole other video about that. But ultimately, it's just a case of people externalizing their internal shame and disconnection onto other people as a way of avoiding looking inside and then realigning themselves with those real values, a real sense of ideological understanding instead of just something they picked up from the external world as an agenda, and their own moral understanding, living in alignment with their own moral truth, basically. When we are being asked by the world to keep taking all this friction on board, we do sometimes start to wake up. We think, okay, something needs to change. Like when we have enough friction in our lives, we eventually reach a kind of breaking point. I see this all the time in my coaching practice. Like people that come to me for coaching, they've reached that point where there's been so much friction, either because they're just going against their own realness because of what's happened to them in the past, or because they're feeling this kind of exasperation and things that we're talking about. They feel so much friction that they reach a kind of breaking point and they're like, right, something has to change, or like, I'm just going to snap, basically. So, and it's not going to be good. So ultimately, people are walking around with this friction, but then there's a next level, there's an extra level of insidiousness. I always use that word these days. But anyway, there's an extra level of insidiousness where the world is designed to encourage the people within it to try and keep the other people in it asleep, if that makes sense, or in this state of friction. And the way that it usually works is we use shame and guilt to stop people from waking up. Like the world is ultimately designed to keep you in this little box that we're talking about, the veil or the matrix. But then the people whose identities are invested within that are going to use shame and guilt against each other to make sure that you don't wake up. And so if you do start rebelling and start living your own values, or you do go against the normative or standardized ideologies that the world is currently pumping out for whatever reason, whatever agenda, then people are going to make you feel guilty. They're going to make you feel ashamed. They're going to make you feel like there's something wrong with you. And that is just going to add to the exasperation. And so what happens in most cases is people run out of steam. They either give up in the sense of thinking that they just don't have enough energy for the fight. And so they just internalize those worldly values, those worldly ideologies, those worldly sense of morals and all that kind of stuff. Or they simply just realize that there's no point fighting. And so they just go through the motions, which is a slightly different way of doing it. In the first case, people trick themselves into really believing that the world is real. In the second case, people know that the world is unreal, but they don't know what to do. And so they just act like it's real so that they can save themselves the unnecessary stress of having all these NPCs try and shame and guilt them into just going deeper and deeper into the illusion. This is ultimately where it comes back to the idea that even though feeling disillusioned or exasperated sucks for obvious reasons, it's also a good thing because it means that you're becoming aware. And once you've started to raise awareness in this manner, then you've got a choice to make. Are you going to keep giving in to the fragmentation of the world, or are you going to choose something that you know is real? When it comes to choosing the real stuff, something that's really helped me is just knowing that what's real is always real. A leopard can't change its spots. And that applies to you as well. One thing that often happens when people find themselves in the situation where they're starting to get exasperated and they're piling up all this friction inside themselves is that they just want a release. And the easiest way, or the path of least resistance, is to just give in to the world, ultimately. The easiest thing to do is to try and adapt, to try and paint the leopard spots so that you can blend in with the world's values and the world's ideologies and the world's sense of morality and just hide all of the things that you know are true by yourself. But the fact is, like we said, a leopard can't change its spots. Maybe you can paint yourself in all these different colors to try and blend in, But those real leopard spots are still there because what's real is always real. And so if you do adapt to the world, you do take on all these external values and ideologies and moral codes, then eventually you're still just going to end up in the same place because you'll get to that point, maybe 5, 10 years down the line, where you realize that you've just been pretending, that you've just been kind of acting out this kind of character within the dream world of the veil or the matrix to make life easier. And then that's when you'll have what they call a midlife crisis, where you realize that you've been living in this ideological, conceptual way instead of experientially. You've been living in the world instead of reality. And then you just have to undo all of the things that you've done to yourself by adapting to that external pressure and the inner friction that you picked up. A leopard can't change its spots. You can't change yours. And like what is real about you is always real. And so the choice is, are you going to adapt so that you can feel a short-term sense of survival? Or are you going to not adapt and you're going to make the world kind of adapt to you instead by going out there, creating a real vision for yourself in alignment with your values, acting on it, but more importantly, accepting the truth about who you are, accepting the truth about what life is, and finding freedom instead of that friction. Adapting to the world in this unreal way is ultimately a survival mechanism. And for the record, we can adapt in a real way. Like obviously, as we go through life, we can't get everything that we want. And so we do have to constantly keep learning and evolving and adjusting our relationship with ourselves and life in a healthy way, which is a kind of way of adapting. This unreal way of adapting means that we just hide ourselves. We cut parts of ourselves off. We forget about who we really are so that we can blend in, like we've been saying. There are 2 things you need to know about these kind of survival mechanisms. The first is that a lot of the time when something hurts us, we try and become like it so that we can survive it next time around. So for example, when a man is hurt by a woman, he will actually tend to become more feminine a lot of the time. When a woman is hurt by a man, she'll become a lot more masculine a lot of the time. And the reason that this happens is because we take on board the strengths, the perceived strengths of the things that have hurt us, because we think it will make us stronger. It'll make us be able to handle things next time around. But if we do that in a way where we forget about our own nature, then it just makes things worse because we end up adding more friction between ourselves and reality. And then as we've seen, that leads to exasperation and disillusionment. It's the same with the world. When the world hurts us, we tend instinctually to become more like the world. So if the world keeps bombarding us with these unreal values and these unreal ideologies and these unreal moral codes, then we take them on board eventually if we run out of energy. It's just a survival instinct. The second thing that we need to know is that these survival instincts only ever work in the short term. If you take on all this stuff, these false values and so on, if you take it on board, then in the short term, it might help you to survive. You might feel a bit better because a lot of the friction of resisting blending in with all this stuff is going to be gone. But in the long term, you're just avoiding the truth about yourself and the truth about life. And the more that you do that, the greater the gap between yourself and real life gets. And you eventually feel the void again, that restlessness, that itch that can't be scratched. And it's just the real you trying to pull you back in. And so ultimately, it comes back to this idea that I've shared, that you can adapt and try and blend in with the world. But if you do that, it's only ever really going to be a short-term solution because eventually the real you is going to wake up and then you're just going to have to reconfigure your life to go back to where you wanted to be in the first place. And so really, the best approach is to see the disillusionment and the exasperation as the start of the process of raising awareness. But as I always say, awareness is just the first step. It goes awareness, acceptance, and action. To go further down the path, then the exasperation and disillusionment, they need to help you raise awareness, but then you need to accept the stuff that we're talking about in this video, which is that you're feeling exasperated, you're feeling disillusioned because you're taking on all this stuff that is not yours. It's not real for you. You can unlearn it. You can realize that the world is not reality. Then you can start acting in alignment with the real stuff. And that's when you're going to get your freedom back, and the disillusionment and the exasperation are no longer going to be a problem, because you're going to be burning through that friction and making it something real rather than just holding onto it and weighing yourself down. So having said all this, what is the way out of the problem of disillusionment or exasperation? Like we just said, it comes down to awareness, acceptance, and action. If you're disillusioned, then ultimately you've started to taste a bitter pill. The pill is in your mouth and it's kind of raising your awareness. It's making you see that there is a gap between who you really are and all of the external stuff that the world is asking you to live according to. The only way to dissolve the disillusionment is to not just taste the pill, but to actually swallow it. When you swallow that pill, it's going to take you from awareness to acceptance. When you get to that place of acceptance, that's when all of this stuff just drops. All of these unreal things that the world is asking you to take on board, that matrix or veil between you and life, once you swallow that pill, it does just kind of melt away, because you realize that the only reason you're breathing life into it is because you've lost touch with the life inside yourself. And when you've got that foundation of acceptance, that's when you get your freedom back. That's when you know who you really are. You remember your nature. You wake up to the truth about yourself. You get rooted in wholeness instead of fragmentation. And you stand there in your realness and you start making decisions from that. Instead of making decisions from the outside in, because of all this stuff we're talking about, making decisions because of unreal values, making decisions because of unreal ideology, making decisions because of unreal sense of morality, you flip the script and you start making decisions from what is real or true. When you do that, you get into the third stage of awareness, acceptance, and action. You put the pill in your mouth. That raised your awareness. You swallowed it and you started to accept yourself and then life, and you could see through all of the bullshit. Then you can start acting from a real place. You can act from your real values. You can create a vision for yourself that brings more of your values into your life. You start thinking for yourself. You don't just take things on board because you read it in the newspaper or because it was on Twitter or whatever the fuck, or you're watching a YouTube video with some idiot like me. You really think for yourself and you know the reasons for why you're doing the things that you're doing. You're not just acting on autopilot. You're living in alignment with your sense of morality. You're not just doing things because the world has made you feel ashamed if you don't do it, or made you feel guilty if you do it, or whatever. You're doing things from a true place, basically. And it all comes from just stepping away from that veil and realizing that the world is not reality, but you are you, and a leopard can't change its spots. So you might as well keep expressing from that place. So that was a video about how the world is not real. It's not reality. If you treat it as being real, then it's going to put you on a path to disillusionment and exasperation. If you're currently feeling disillusioned and exasperated, then congratulations, because it's a sign that you're becoming aware of this trap that we can fall into, treating the world as being something it isn't. Ultimately, the lesson is that you need to give your time, energy, and attention to the real stuff. Your time, energy, and attention are the most important things that you have, the most precious things. Life is short. And so if you are feeling exasperated and disillusioned in the way we've been talking about, then it just is a sign that you need to shift your focus onto something real. Get in touch with your real values. Find a real tribe or build a real tribe. Don't just be going through the motions of living on autopilot and then wondering why you feel that itch that something needs to change. Shift your focus onto the real stuff and the rest will fall into place. And the way that you do it is by stepping back from the world, realizing that what's real is always real and that a leopard really can't change its spots, and that applies to you too. So build on your awareness of those spots. If you feel disillusioned, then the next step is to swallow that pill all the way. Don't be walking around with this bitter taste in your mouth. Go all the way. And on the other side of that, you'll find your real life. So hope that helps you. If anybody wants to talk about this stuff or, insult me, call me names, whatever it is, because I've touched a nerve with this video, there's a link on my website, ollieanderson.co.uk/talk. I really think that life is amazing and that all of our lives can be amazing. And all we need to do is just stay real. Keep focused on the real stuff. So yeah, if anyone wants to work on that stuff or talk about it, book a call on my site. Otherwise, thanks for watching. Peace to you.